Hi, everyone, and welcome to our plenary, our keynote for today at the Global Opportunities After College Fair. This is, my name is Emily Gorlewski, and I work at Wesleyan University, and I have the pleasure of introducing one of our distinguished alumni, Talia Zemak-Burson. And she is going to give a talk today about international education and U.S. global power. So all of you who are wanting to go abroad, if you haven't had the chance to go abroad, or if you have gone abroad in the past, you will definitely resonate with some of Talia's points here. So without further ado, Dr. Talia Zemak-Burson.
Hello, thank you, Emily. I cannot, well, let's see, can I see who's here? If you don't mind, I'm going to make some moments. Yes, hello, everybody. I'm going to make this participatory via the chat box at a few points. So I won't put anyone on the spot, but I might ask for some participation if people are keen for it, okay? I'll just begin, but will you please give me a shout out if something happens tech-wise that I need to pay attention to? Okay, thank you. All right. On October 25th, 2001, let's do this. A little over 1 month after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, President George Bush addressed the students at Thurgood Marshall Extended Elementary School in Washington, D.C. We're here talking about how we can best conduct a war against evil, the president explained to his young audience, some of whom were of preschool age. You can be an integral part of that, he told them. The Washington Post noted that the youngsters were not your typical military enlistees. Some sucked their thumbs. A few fell asleep while receiving their marching orders. Others fidgeted. But as, quote, fighters in the latest front in the war effort, the tots at Thurgood Marshall Extended Elementary School in Northeast Washington were just the sort of recruits Commander-in-Chief George W. Bush wanted. The children's special mission, Bush announced, was to build ties of trust and friendship with people all around the world. I can do that through diplomacy, Bush assessed, but boys and girls all across America can do that job pretty darn well too. Bush's Secretary of Education, Rod Page, agreed. One of the best ways to combat terror, he announced, is to build strong and lasting relationships between American children and those from other countries and cultures. As peculiar as this scene sounds, I should hope it sounds peculiar, a president enlisting elementary school students to fight the war on terror, it wasn't a one-off publicity stunt. A few weeks later, Bush released a statement calling on the nation's teachers, parents, and community leaders to increase opportunities for American students to learn about the world. In light of the extraordinary times we are facing following the September 11th terrorist attacks, Bush argued, America's leadership and security rests on our commitment to educate and prepare our youth for active engagement in the international community. A few years later, Emily, you'll like to see this, as a junior in college, I studied abroad. I don't look so hot there, but that sort of gives you really a sense of how I felt about my adventures. But seriously, like so many students who spend a semester abroad, the decision to do so felt really personal, right? Sort of individualistic. It didn't occur to me that my semester abroad was at all connected to the matter of national security or America's geopolitical strength, leadership, any of that stuff that I just read for you. Yet, the Senate declared that same year the year of study abroad on the grounds that the, quote, security, stability, and economic vitality of the United States hung in the balance. A wide coalition of policymakers and educators together feared that American global supremacy was at risk because American citizens seemed to be globally incompetent, lacking the knowledge necessary to keep America safe. As one education task force put it, the events of September 11th constitute a wake-up call, a warning that America's ignorance of the world is now a national liability. Translating geopolitical conflict into a narrative of educational failure at home, policymakers shifted sort of blame and responsibility onto the individualized citizen. Because Americans were neither globally competent nor globally literate, a congressional commission concluded, the United States is, this is a quotation, not as well equipped to exercise its leadership role as it needs to be. The situation is dangerous. It threatens our capacity to defend our values. Above all, it threatens the national interest. It wasn't until I returned from my semester that I discovered that what I had sought out for personal and academic reasons was actually part of, or at least within the context, should be understood in the context of this governmental effort to protect and bolster US global power. To me, as a college student, it seemed that my political agency as a private citizen had been overwritten by the state without me having even known it. So that was the spark that troubled me. And I've now spent, I don't know, definitely maybe 15 years studying the ties that bind students to foreign policy interests through the mechanism or industry of international education. Briefly, though times have changed, enthusiasm for international education's transformative political potential has not. Here's a quotation from Michelle Obama in 2011. With every friendship you make, every bond of trust you establish, you are shaping the image of America projected to the rest of the world. So when you study abroad, you are actually helping to make America stronger. Trump's Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, speaks in an only slightly different register, explaining just last year that students studying abroad are among the most important tools in our diplomatic arsenal, upon which the success of our foreign policy depends. By demonstrating American values and ideals to the entire world, Pompeo continued, students are able to maintain America's leadership role in the world. American students who develop, quote, cultural intelligence by learning foreign languages and studying other cultures, Trump's Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, added, keep America safe. Now, learning about the world is such an important thing. Learning new languages, making new connections with people from nations other than your own is also so important. And it's entirely true. We do need to be able to understand and communicate with one another to avoid violent conflict and exploitation, et cetera, et cetera. But I want you to reflect for a minute about what it means and what the consequences could be of these attempts to link education to the specific foreign policy needs of the federal government. So you can just take a minute if you want and throw up in the chat if this provokes any concerns for you. What would you be concerned about? There's no like right answer or wrong answer. That's a very good comment. Right, there's something very ill-defined about all of this, right? Okay, so for the sake of time, I'll keep it. Is it suggesting there's a reason or specific goal rather than, yeah, that's right. Or that cultural exchange itself is enacting some kind of a goal, right? So what about academic freedom, right? What can be taught, what can't be taught? If this is supposed to be flowing in the direction of bolstering US power and America's reputation in the world. What about consent or awareness? Does it matter if a student is aware or not? That even Michelle Obama says that the friendships they make are about, you know, making the world more friendly to American interests? Yeah, that's right. Andrew, the question of agency. Can you change it? Can you not change it? So sort of a question about student resistance or agency. How does that fit in? There's also a question of surveillance or government control. Does the government just say these things for like rhetorical powers? And that's nice because then funding flows, if it flows at all. But that there's not actually some kind of control making sure that things are happening the way those in power want it to. Another question is maybe this blurring of public and private, right? The relationship of education to the state. Okay, so there are a lot of concerns that might be raised. In my opinion, too often there's a kind of sympathetic consensus around international education that insulates it from the kind of critical analysis that we are used to seeing across the academic fields, right? So like I'm teaching a class right now on tourism, and like it's so hard to make my syllabus because there's so many critical articles on tourism, or there's classes on humanitarianism and aid, right? And there's a whole wealth of critical academic scholarship, interdisciplinary scholarship, taking a look at this. But what we might call global citizenship education more broadly, I think is suspended in a powerful web of protection. As you can see from these advertisements, students are drawn into this orbit because it appeals to a sense of adventure and also hope for the creation of a better, more understanding future. Schools enjoy looking kind of cosmopolitan and fit for the modern world, right? You wouldn't want to be a nationalistic, right? Corporate interests think international education produces the kind of cross-culturally competent global managerial class that they need for business. And often parents think that international experience will endow their children with a new veneer of independence or maturity. As you saw, like across political divides, Michelle Obama and Mike Pompeo are in agreement about this. So when it comes to international education, we seem to kind of all be in it together, even if people think that they're getting different interests out of it. And within this web of various investments, it's sometimes hard to ask the difficult ethical questions, let alone point out the fact that the many players at the table, from the US foreign policy establishment down to the individual student, really might not actually understand their relationship to one another or share the same values and goals. So today, sorry, that was a long lead in. I hope to crack open some of this consensus so that we can begin to more successfully disentangle our own, your own educational priorities and values from the larger systems. And I'm going to do so by giving you a whirlwind American history tour. I apologize for that, but I think it's sort of the best way to understand this. So we're going to trace the emergence of international education as a foreign policy tool branch of the state, beginning at the dawn of the 20th century. I'm wary of time. I like you participating though. So, okay, if you were alive in the first decade of the 20th century, what might you observe? This is go back to your US history. What might you observe about the emerging nature of America's relationship to the world? Throw that up in the chat. We're talking about like, there you go. Industrialization, urbanization, immigration, and US imperialism. We're a little bit earlier than where you are, Emerald, like turn of the century. We're going to get there. So first of all, War with Spanish, yes. After defeating Spain in the 1898 Spanish-American War, America becomes full-fledged empire with overseas territories, exhibiting growing appetite for economic and imperial influence. And this economic appetite for influence is exploding. The Industrial Revolution had so transformed the landscape that by 1909, the US is the lead exporter of both capital and goods to the rest of the world. This is also a time of huge technological advancements. Americans lived in a society remade in terms of communication and travel, immigration, powerful world economy in which capital is circulating with more ease than ever. Much of this world was in closer, faster, and easier contact than ever before. A lot of people observed this with a tremendous amount of enthusiasm that definitely, I think is repeated in our rhetoric about globalization today. They looked at America's growing political and economic power, combined with this increasingly interconnected world. And many people anticipated the rise of a worldwide, peaceful and cooperative, interdependent human society that they hoped would be guided by the superior yet benevolent hand of US leadership. The people who were really excited about this kind of, they called it worldism, not globalization back then, were generally drawn from a group of powerful Anglo-Saxon American elites. So we're talking about statesmen, university presidents, philanthropists, leaders in business, law, industry, like Andrew Carnegie, Columbia University president Nicholas Murray Butler, but also anti-war activists and reformers like Jane Addams. They believed that a peaceful and interconnected global society was to be the highest achievement of civilization. But they had a really big problem. If they actually looked at America itself, it did not seem like citizens were well prepared to lead a peaceful, interconnected world society, right? So like the attitudes of native-born Americans were not always favorable to this. There was a great appetite for war, rampant nativism and isolationism, a lot of resistance to foreign entanglements, and a lot of ignorance and white supremacy, tons of anti-immigrant violence and xenophobia. So this is like a country that looks hardly equipped to lead a global world order. Many people in power felt that these behaviors were threatening to hold America back from taking on the mantle of a world leader. They worried that the American people lacked the psychological capacity, let alone the intellectual capacity, to manage the realities of this new world order and global economy. So what did they turn to? Education. They turned to education to produce what they described as a different psychology in the citizen of the future. Columbia University president Nicholas Murray Butler called not for hard knowledge, right? This wasn't about getting international relations programs in schools, although they supported that too. But it was about cultivating a new habit of thinking, which Butler called the international mind. So what we witnessed during this time, and I apologize, not all of these pictures are fit for the right time period, but we see a flurry of new educational programming in primary and secondary schools, as well as colleges and universities. It's led by major foundations, and also K through 12 teachers across the country. There are new civics curriculums that teach global citizenship, school pageants celebrating internationalism, student exchange opportunities, letter writing campaigns, children's books illustrating the brotherhood of man, and even a federally recognized Peace Day in public schools. In higher education, there are cosmopolitan clubs formed where cross-national friendships were supposed to be fostered so that people would see themselves as citizens of the world. There's a hitch to all of this. For many of the educators and curriculum builders, international education was closely tied to a set of political beliefs that they held, a kind of enthusiasm for US empire, and also an enthusiasm for Anglo supremacy. One global citizenship civics curriculum written in 1910, for example, taught children that Anglo-Saxons were uniquely gifted people endowed with great mental and physical power who would bring vigor and civilization to the Orient and Africa. And this is, historians today sometimes celebrate this as our first global citizenship curriculum. Children were taught to feel responsible for their peers in Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the Philippines, to celebrate how the US shared the wonders of Western progress with Japan, civilized the Indians, brought industry and commerce to Greece and China, etc. As you can imagine, that Kipling poem, The White Man's Burden, was certainly included in the curriculum. So if this curriculum was to turn young American citizens into kindly citizens of the world, as it said, it was certainly done so in the name of upholding a very specific set of values and ideals. Oh, sorry. In higher education, there's a similar enthusiasm for the spirit of internationalism. Colleges and universities in the US, and we're still before World War I here, right? Colleges and universities in the US had the benefit of being host to a growing number of foreign students. Enthusiastic observers declared that international students and their American classmates would come to see themselves as citizens of the world, part of a brotherhood of man. But again here, this pleasant rhetoric is hiding some more explicit nationalist and political goals. First of all, many of those international students were from the Philippines or Puerto Rico, America's colonial subjects, brought to the US to be educated according to US interests. Many of them were teachers who were coming to be trained in the US at how to be teachers so that they would then go back to their countries and be able to kind of advance US interests through their teaching, sort of an efficient kind of colonial system. Many other students were from China because in 1909, Teddy Roosevelt, then president, arranged fellowships for Chinese students to study in the US in the hopes of advancing America's, quote, moral, intellectual, and commercial influence in China. Special organizations cropped up on college campuses to influence the character, spirit, and attitudes of international students, and to ensure that they were brought under the best influence of the Western nations. In truth, a lot of those efforts were born from the realization that many of these international students were experiencing racism in American towns and cities where they were attending college. And there was a growing concern that those students would return to their home countries with actually a negative perception of the United States. So a lot of the kinds of clubs organized to teach world brotherhood and world citizenship were done in an effort to kind of manage America's reputation. World War I would interrupt many of these efforts, but it didn't really deter them ultimately. It more like proved their necessity. Why? Well, like what lessons would you learn from the war? The importance of US leadership, the importance of people learning to cooperate and live together, the fact that programs like this were necessary if Americas were going to embrace the mantle of leadership, because as you know, the US retreats from that role after the war. The war also reminded people that we really were living in an interconnected global society, and we'd better figure out how to live together. And because also after the war, there's a retrenchment of isolationist nationalism. So the US public really doesn't seem fit to take on a position of global leadership. So for a lot of people, the idea that education was going to be necessary here became more and more important. After World War I, the federal government maybe retreated from the world stage in an official capacity, but Boy Scouts of America initiated world jamborees and offered Scouts membership in the World Brotherhood of Boys. The Junior Red Cross coordinated an international school correspondence program. They actually filtered the letters to make sure that there was nothing that might create international tensions in those letters. And public school children formed world friendship clubs. Church groups orchestrated the international exchange of toy dolls. Even Parents Magazine offered tips on how to rear citizens of the world. And during this time, colleges and universities initiated study abroad opportunities for academic credit. Student travel, as the president of Smith College put it, was the best and most effective thing that educational institutions could do for the fitting of our students for the life of a citizen in the post-war world. One new student travel organization for high school students that appeared after World War I was the Experiment in International Living, which maybe some of you are familiar with. This student travel organization dedicated itself to accepting, quote, only the finest America has to send, with minds and bodies above the average. If that sounds like slightly eugenicist language to you, you wouldn't be wrong. Though the program insisted it was working for world peace and international understanding, it prioritized for many years its trips to Nazi Germany, where the Experiment in International Living, I'm watching some faces, was running from 1933 to 1939, where students attended Nazi rallies and parades and joined in the activities of Nazi youth groups. As you can see in this picture here, this is a group of students traveling with the Experiment in International Living. And that was run in the New York Times to much critique, really. Sergeant Shriver, you know who Sergeant Shriver is? He's the first director of the Peace Corps. He attended this program before his freshman year at Yale. And he reported upon his return to Yale, and I found this in the Yale Daily News, that the German truly wants us to be their friends because they saw in America, more than in almost any other nation of the world, people whom they believed were their kind. Stripped of any concern for social justice or even like a moral commitment, the Experiment in International Living illustrates to us, should be a reminder to us, of just how easy it was to embrace an internationalist spirit of world brotherhood and peace and understanding that upholds privileged global white supremacist alliances. The racist, the classist, the political presumptions of many of the interwar international education initiatives were not lost on America's more radical critics. Right? Like, I'm not telling this story for the first time. It was being told in real time by critics on the left. Take, for example, the work of the Communist Party's youth group, the Young Pioneers. In 1935, when President Franklin Roosevelt hosted an international Boy Scout jamboree in the nation's capital, the Young Pioneers, this is the communist youth group, accused Roosevelt of strategically fostering international brotherhood between young Americans and, quote, just those countries which everyone knows are controlled by American interests. Moreover, the pioneers pointed out, the jamboree was to be a segregated affair, teaching youth that, quote, contempt or hatred for their brothers of another race is part of the right attitude of mind for world citizenship. The scouts who pledge international brotherhood today will be set at each other's throats like mad dogs tomorrow, the pioneers observed. For though they celebrated goodwill, they had yet to free themselves from the grips of capitalist control and thus remain subordinate to those who profit by destruction. As the Young Pioneers argued so clearly, global citizenship initiatives were in no way taking an apolitical stance. I'm just going to move ahead a little bit faster. Okay. By the late 1930s, educators were not the only ones interested in the benefits of facilitating opportunities for American students to travel abroad. Up in the chat, does anyone remember what's going on in US Latin American relationships in the late 1930s? What's going on with US Latin American relations? Okay, well, you're lucky because I will keep plowing ahead regardless. At the behest of President Roosevelt's good neighbor policy, does that ring bells? A broad campaign aimed at shifting US power in Latin America from interventionist military and territorial domination to economic and cultural hegemony, the US State Department had begun to experiment with new forms of educational diplomacy. Sometimes referred to as the chosen instrument approach, this new foreign policy formula required that the government merely assist and coordinate the international activities of private agencies, as any cultural initiatives interpreted as government propaganda would be rendered ineffective. As private citizens, American students appeared capable of gaining the friendship, confidence, and cooperation and respect of South Americans in a way that official government representatives felt they could not. In 1940, for example, the Department of State and the Council of National Defense provided the Experiment in International Living, of all organizations, with financial backing to launch a series of new student travel programs in Latin America, with the requirement that the programs take the appearance of a, quote, this was an order from the State Department, a spontaneous expression of friendliness of the people of the United States. Such programs, one government official noted, had the added benefit of training the young Americans to accept the coming role of world leadership. By the time the US entered World War II, international education was well on its way to becoming a calculated vehicle for achieving foreign policy aims, both specific and general, through this state-private sector alliance. When the US emerges from World War II with more geopolitical power than ever before, the idea that now you understand was longstanding, that Americans would need to learn how to carry their responsibility as world citizens, took an even more urgent cast. Educators, government officials, foundations, leaders of public thought, and psychiatrists and social scientists in the aftermath of World War II all launched a full-throated effort to make world citizenship education a standard national practice. Even a special presidential commission on education, called for by President Truman, demanded that American students be educated directly and explicitly to develop a global vision and the international mind. The task facing educators only intensified as the contours of the Cold War came into focus in the immediate post-war years. Not only did young Americans need to understand their duties, they were now sutured into a foreign policy conundrum as key players in this bilateral power struggle between the US and the Soviet Union. One government-sponsored program known as Operation Understanding, for example, shuttled American students across the Atlantic for 3 summers aboard decommissioned World War II troop ships in the hopes that the student diplomats would cultivate a, quote, legacy of friendship in post-war Europe that would have an important bearing on the security of the world. These students were called America's Goodwill Navy. Student groups who were considered too leftist, such as those who openly agitated against the poison of white supremacy or advocated the right of labor to organize and civil liberties for colored people, were denied passage above these decommissioned troop ships. And those who were approved to travel were trained in how to appropriately discuss US race relations and American economic inequality in a way that secured US innocence and the virtues of democratic progress. So while they were aboard these boats, they were carefully trained in how to represent the United States. Any teacher on the boat who failed to do so appropriately was reported and questioned by the State Department. Here is a picture of Secretary of State George Marshall receiving a briefing on the project. But then next to it, you'll see a poster advertising the World Youth Festival, which was a leftist Soviet-backed youth conference that some of the Goodwill Navy participants snuck off to, despite being forbidden from doing so. When they arrived in Prague to attend the World Youth Festival, they organized protests against the poison of white supremacy and distributed signs declaring death to the lynchers. The State Department, when they received a briefing on this, was horrified. And they even sent the CIA to Prague to try to infiltrate and report on these student groups. I should add, there's an unsolved mystery here. The man that Marshall is depicted with, the younger guy here on the far right, that's Lawrence Dugan, Larry Dugan. His father, Stephen Dugan, founded IIE, the Institute of International Education. And Larry Dugan had run the Latin America desk at the State Department. So he was following his father's work in the State Department, running these goodwill, these good neighbor policy programs. But he suddenly left the State Department and he went and took over the Institute for International Education when his father passed. And so that's why he's here in his capacity as the director of the Institute for International Education. But just a year later, after this picture is taken, Larry Dugan will be accused of having been a member of the same Soviet spy ring that Alger Hiss was a part of. Now, interestingly, Alger Hiss was at that time the director of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And IIE and the Carnegie Endowment, Larry Dugan and Alger Hiss, had actually cooperated in orchestrating Operation Understanding and the Goodwill Navy for the State Department after World War II. It gets a little more messy because Larry Dugan was found dead outside the windows of the IIE offices in New York City, and it was ruled an accident caused by him trying to pull on an overshoe on a rainy day. But other people believe that he may have been assassinated by the handler of his spy ring, and or possibly, suicide caused by the distress of having been named in the spy ring. So I'm going to give you just one other example of how these things can be politically complicated. By the late 1970s, there were upwards of 50,000 Iranian students studying in the United States. Why? Because the Shah saw education as an investment in his modernization program. And American officials saw in Iranian students this opportunity to advance America's interests through the strategic cultivation of friendship and goodwill. Should be familiar to you now. But imagine the surprise of both countries to learn that 50 of the students who took those embassy workers hostage in 1979 had recently returned from studying abroad in America. They used their knowledge of English and US culture not to forge closer relationships between the two countries, but rather to translate stolen embassy documents, to interrogate their captives, and to communicate effectively with Western media. So I'm going to end my history rampage there on this note of unintended consequences and student resistance. But I hope that these anecdotes have helped to shed new light on the politics of international education. When education is tied to a specific set of politics, what other forms of educational possibilities are lost? How should we understand the freedoms of you, the individual students or the individual educators? By framing international education as a personal adventure, right, or a personal academic good, we deny students of the opportunity to articulate for themselves how they stand in relation to geopolitics, how to understand the political potential of their own education. What would it look like for us to follow in the footsteps of those students who protested lynching and white supremacy in Prague? These students were part of the State Department's Goodwill Navy, but they intentionally crafted their own divergent political journeys. And that is the note on which I will close. And if we have time, I am happy to answer questions or just hear your thoughts. I will stop the screen share.
We have time for some questions, so We can take the questions, I think, by you can unmute and speak up, or you can put them in the chat.
Can be questions, or it can just be thoughts or add to the story.
I loved all of your pictures. You have so many. They're so amazing. Where did you find all of them?
These are, I was looking at if I had given this slideshow, dug through my old computers and my old external hard drives, I would have found more. But to do this research, I went to many, 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 many archives all across the country. And so many of these are pulled from photographs that I took in archival collections. I'm SIT, so as you all know, the Experiment in International Living is now part of World Learning, which includes SIT, the School for International Training. And when I went into their archives, they actually still had moving pictures. Like they actually still had, they had videos of the kids marching in Germany with the Nazi youth. So there are all kinds of records. I mean, and when I went into IIE's archive, they were like, we're not very organized. We don't really know what we have. And I opened up a drawer and I found the coroner's report for Larry Dugan. So there's a ton out there that we have not looked at.
It's amazing.
And also there's this amazing, and I couldn't find it in my folders, but Life magazine did like a huge multi-page piece of photo essay on Operation Understanding. They Life magazine traveled aboard the boats, and so we have tons of pictures of the students on the ships. And the students also made like a shipboard newspaper, which we have all the records of. So there's a lot.
I noticed in the I'm just going to keep talking until people have questions, because I have lots of questions for you, even though I have heard you speak before. So the students some people in the chat talking about seeing here acting as a pawn for America's international relations, even just by being a student, forcing people to work for a political agenda they may not agree with. It makes me wonder if I even have agency in this, if the act of being an American abroad is already accomplishing some political goal. Mm-hmm. So you pointed out the example of the students who the students who snuck off to Prague, mm-hmm. Which we would not condone necessarily as study abroad, advisors, health and safety and all of that. We want to know where you are, but that was an example of students taking back the narrative. And so what other ways can you see for a student or someone taking part in a global opportunity after college? How can they do that same kind of thing?
I would love to hear from the student, if we had participating students, which I see we don't, that's fine. I'm just very curious to know how students feel about this and how students would navigate it. It seems to me that there's also, and I'm curious to know from those of you who, work in the field, to what extent, so my first answer is to say, if you understand the project as partly political and not simply personal, right? It's not just personal development, it also plays into geopolitics. Then just that knowledge itself gives you some level of awareness and agency to think through the politics of your encounters, more than just like, I'm a representative of the United States. But then I'm also thinking that all health and safety related, you probably don't encourage students to get too involved politically, right? So if students wanted to get involved in political activism or protest, anti-US protests and activities, I imagine that sounds pretty dangerous and risky to you.
Yes, yeah. Certainly for those of us working in the field, that's definitely in all of our pre-departure orientation materials. Don't get into protests in your study abroad country.
Right. So then I
That
think
being said, though, I mean, our students still find ways to be involved, and we have a global like photo contest, and a lot of times students will submit photos of them participating or witnessing protests, and definitely engaging with what's going. I mean, it's this struggle. We want them to be safe, but at the same time, we want them to be able to engage and understand what's going on. So it's a fine line, really.
I'm just reading what Carter just wrote here. That's right, that the programs can be inherently political without sort of explicit formal activist engagement. Yeah, so the politics of where does your program go, where does they stay? I mean, the program that I went to was the SIT's Tibetan Studies program. So it was like Nepal, India, and Tibet. And we definitely stayed at Chinese owned hotels all the time, right? And like we definitely were not, I wouldn't call it like a kind of ethical, like the fair trade kind of study abroad, where they're aware, where is our money going? Who are we supporting? Whose interests are we supporting? How can we use our bodies in a useful, non-harm causing way? Yeah. Looks like Andrew's. Oh boy, that's a good question. There's a new book that has a chapter on this. If I could get up and walk around my bookshelf right now, I would, but I won't. I do believe it has happened. Yes, absolutely. And I also do believe that US foreign intelligence has also recruited students like on the ground in the countries in which they are studying. And the State Department does have videos and trainings that I guess you guys are supposed to show students, right? Training them how to avoid being recruited into spy-like sabotage subterfuge of the United States, right? I'm curious to hear more from you, the educators, right? I mean, if we have time left, because this is the kind of thing you're trying to, this is the historical perspective. And I guess what I'd like you to do with if I could choose two takeaways for this historical context, it's one, to understand that there is something both explicitly and inherently political and or participatory in US geopolitics about international education, study abroad. But two, that there's also a long tradition of protest and resistance and or cracks in which the intended consequence isn't actually happening. If any group of humans are unruly and unpredictable, it's college students, right? Very hard to control. So those are the two takeaways I would want you to have from this history to remind yourself of. Emily, do you want to take this question? This last one here?
Sure. I mean, I guess it's it's kind of, we work with all different organizations, and we do, I mean, at Wesleyan, and I'm sure at many of the other schools, we explicitly look for what is the relationship of the program to its host location, and what, like the people obviously in the host location, although also maybe, you know, the environment and resources and things like this. So we definitely, before we approve a program, will look into that. With that said, have we done that recently with all of our programs? Not necessarily, but it is something that if you have a regular review process, it would be something I think that comes up. I'm seeing nodding from my study abroad colleagues from the other schools. So this is something we look at, and so it would be if a program is on our approved list, that means that at some point we have deemed it, to be at least, ethically engaging with the host communities. But if there is, additional information that's also, if they are doing things like that on purpose, I think you will be able to find that on their website and
Yes.
or talk
There
to their.
are a bunch of study abroad programs that really sell themselves as being more equitable and social justice oriented, but I don't know about their practices well enough to throw their names out right now or up in the chat box. I know there are plenty who say this, that this is what they do.
I mean, it's a really difficult thing to do because you're there for a short period of time, and how you engage with the community is going to be superficial at a certain level, right? Because it takes time, and it takes definitely, language and culture are very tied. And if you aren't fluent in the language, and that takes a long time to do, you're not going to be fluent in the culture. So the setup of a 6-week program to a semester program, or even a year, it's really difficult to get the ethics right. I think a lot of the organizations, I know a lot of the organizations that we send our students on have statements about this. There's a lot of talk about this at international educators conferences. It's a big concern, but it's also really hard to implement given the nature of the time of it, I think.
I think the question also is, and at least the question that I've seen students ask is trying to figure out, and I think someone said this in the chat, is there something inherently political about being a representative of the United States, showing your privileges, showing your mobility? And it's like, right, so it's like, then you say, oh, no, like the United States isn't actually all Trumpists. No, right? And so it's like, okay, well, that's a very good representative of the United States abroad, right? And then you say, oh, like, actually, like, no, the United States isn't like super ideal. Like, there's so many problems at home, like, blah, 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 blah. But you're also seen as a representative who's being critical of your own country, and you're having the freedoms to like say these things. So then the students who I talk to go, oh God, like, is there any way that I cannot be kind of spreading pro-US propaganda? And I just obviously don't have answers, but I do think that thinking about these things is really good. Thinking about how your personal interactions are not just about your own growth or gratification or learning, but are like fitting into like a larger context is so important. And then also, if we acknowledge that there's no escaping the problematic context of US global power, then it doesn't become a question of, am I engaging with it or am I not? And more about, what are the decisions that I'm comfortable making? What are the decisions that I'm not comfortable making, right? Like, do you wear sweatshop labor clothes? Probably, right? That doesn't feel good, does it? Right? But there's like a series of questions and ethical value judgments that we all make about living our own lives. And I think study abroad is another one of the fields in which we need to sort of normalize thinking about making those decisions, as opposed to looking for a program where it'll all be, taken care of.
Good point. There, we've got another question from Carter in the chat: how to interact with communities we engage with in abroad programs.
when you come back.
Yes. Yeah. Mhm.
I think my answer would be the same as my last answer, right? Like, certainly is complicated and murky. But if you do have personal relationships and connections, I think one of them, and I know this is going to make me sound like a total sentimentalist who's like falling right in the palms, but to treat human beings as human beings who matter, rather than as human beings who served you some value on your journey, or rather as human beings who are so defined by their place in the world that like all you ever see them as is like the political, right? To actually build real friendships is possible even in super messed up powered contexts. You just acknowledge that there are power differentials. You notice that there's a politics to this. And if you can talk about it, this is the truth for building friendships with anyone, right? If you can talk about it, if you can acknowledge it as human beings, as friends, I think there's immense radical potential in that kind of human connection. But not talking about it certainly hasn't ever helped anybody.
Any more questions for Dr. Zimak-Berson before we close? And seeing none, thank you so much for being with us here today. You've really given us a lot to think about. And I hope that we can stay in touch. And students, all the best to you with thinking about your experiences abroad.
Thank you for having me.